It's the steps in making bread.
All right, guys. So here's the plan for today. We are going to get good things for our explore page this morning. Candy, that's your group today. You guys have good things. And then we are going to grade the assignment from yesterday, page 423, numbers 1A, 1C, and then 2A, B, and C. So we'll get that going here in a moment. And then we're going to jump into section 3. So that's how today is going to run. Let's go get your good things written down. I'll take attendance right quick. Alright guys, let's go and do good things. So, Alex, what do you have for us?
It's my birthday today.
Your birthday. Happy birthday. 14, right? 13? How old are you turning this? 27. Oh, alright. Fantastic. So, how old will be little school with it? You guys doing anything special for your birthday tonight? Or you guys gonna celebrate this weekend?
I don't really know.
You don't know? Alright. Well, happy 27th birthday to you, Alex. Congratulations. 1, 2. Mama? How was that? Pretty good? Was it as good as Get Out? Or just at the end? Alright, well, glad you enjoyed it. 1, 2. Gabby? First softball practice. Very cool. What position do you play? Second? Very cool. Very cool. How long have you been playing for? 3 years? Alright, well, have fun. Best of luck to you. 1, 2. Alright, Kaylee, what do you got for us? 8 new books. Very cool. Which one are you most excited to read? You don't know? You're excited to get into them? Alright, well, have fun. 1, 2. Alright guys, so go ahead and get your papers out. Make sure you have a red pen to grade with. Alright guys, let's get started. So, alright guys, let's get started. Question number 1A. What was the largest social group in the South, and how did its members make a living? So, the largest social group in the South was the yeomen, and they made their living by farming. Remember, these were, like I said in the book, that very first sentence in the yeoman section was, most white Southerners were yeomen. So, there were the yeomen. These were the ones that owned about the 100-acre farms, and they owned a few slaves, but typically if they didn't enslave, not a lot. Alright, question 1C. Which Southern social class do you think had the most difficult life and why? So, for me, I put the Southern social class that had the most difficult life was the free African Americans. This is because many Southern governments passed laws to restrict their rights. That they didn't allow them to vote, travel certain places, things like that. 3 points.
Is this all in the
Yeah, it's your personal view. So if you guys put something different, maybe you put the poor whites. Give me a reason as to why you think it was them. So you gotta have a group. You have to restate the question. Give a group that they think had the hardest life and a reason why. 3 points there. All right, question 2A. What jobs were available to free African Americans in the South, and why were these jobs the only ones available? So, the only jobs really available to free African Americans in the South were to work as plantation or farm laborers, carpentry, blacksmithing, and these were the only jobs that were available because these were the only jobs people were willing to hire them for. All right. Question 2B. Why did many white Southerners fear free African Americans? So, many white Southerners feared free African Americans because they feared that their slaves might want to be free as well and run away or revolt. For 3 points. All right, and last one, 2C. Why do you think that discrimination against free African Americans was harsher in the South than in the North? So, I put discrimination of free African Americans was harsher in the South than in the North because white Southerners believed that free African Americans could not take care of themselves and that they threatened the institution of slavery. They wanted to try and keep them doing what they wanted for 3 points. All right, folks, so as you can tell, it's added 16 points. So put the number right out of 16 at the top, and then give it back. Once you're satisfied with your grade, go ahead and put it in the middle. And I will come around and collect them here in a moment. And make sure if you borrowed a red pen, put it back in the cups. Alright, so now let's go ahead and get into what we're going to talk about today, which is the slave system. So we're going to get into slavery here, and so just kind of to start off, it's really important that you guys kind of pay attention here for a quick second. So, we're talking about slavery is a dark part of our history. These are facts. They're not making things up. This is what actually happened. So, I need you guys to be very mature when we're talking about this. It is a very mature topic to talk about. Like I said, it is a dark part of our history, but we need to make sure we understand our history so we don't repeat it. So, with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and get into the slave system today. So, we're going to start on page 424, and I'm going to read the If You Were There and the building background. You guys started. So, if you were there. You are a reporter from a newspaper in Philadelphia in the 1850s. You are writing a series of articles about the slave system in the South. You get background for your stories, you are planning to interview some former slaves who now live in Philadelphia. Some have bought their freedom, while others have successfully escaped from slavery. So, building background. While most Southern families were not slaveholders, the Southern economy depended on the work of slaves. It was true not only on large plantations, but also on smaller farms and in cities. Few chances existed for enslaved African Americans to escape their hard lives. So, I mean, this is going to be a dark topic. I'm not going to skate over that. This is going to be darker, so I need you guys to be very mature when we're talking about this, okay? So, in your groups, I would like for you guys to read page 424. There's two sections, slaves and work and working in the fields, about 3 paragraphs, and then we will come back together and we will discuss it a little deeper. So, let's go ahead and get started.
Most enslaved African Americans in rural areas lived on farms and plantations. On large plantations, slaves usually did a variety of jobs. On large plantations, slaves were assigned specific jobs. Most worked in the fields. Most slave owners demanded to slaves work as much as possible to provide teaching lessons to drivers who were sometimes slave visitors to make sure that the slaves followed orders and carried out punishment system. Most plantation owners used the gang labor system. In this system, all field hands worked the same task at the same time. They usually worked from sun up to sundown.
All right, guys, so let's go ahead and get started. So, slave labor. Most enslaved African Americans lived in rural areas where they worked on farms and plantations. On large plantations, most slaves were assigned specific jobs. So, some slaves, they might be assigned to work in the fields. Some might be assigned to work in the house, as a house slave. Others, especially as we talked about the other day, actually I think we talked about yesterday, how some had the skilled jobs, so they could be carpenters, they could be blacksmiths, they could be musicians. Most, actually, they worked in the fields, because farming was the way that the plantation owner, that master, that's how they made money. So most slaves were field hands. Supervisors, they were known as drivers, and sometimes they were slaves as well. So the drivers, their job was to make sure that slaves followed orders and that they carried out punishments. So this is where one of the most common punishments was where they would whip them to get them to do what they wanted. Zach?
Wouldn't you think that mostly of the slaves were these kind of people?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The drivers were some of the most hated people on the plantation. And because they were the ones, like I said, who carried out the whippings, who carried out the beatings. Absolutely, yes. These were some of the most hated people on the plantation. Good question. Does anybody have any questions about this so far? All right, so we'll go ahead and continue on. We're gonna talk about working in the fields, sort of what that was like. So, most plantation owners, they use the gang labor system, which is what you can see pictured here. So what they would do is they had the slaves, they would walk just along the rows of cotton, picking them as they went. And I don't know how well you can see it. I'll try blowing the picture up. Looks like, so you can kind of see this lady here, she had a bag here. It was very common, they had like a satchel where they would walk along and just put the cotton once they picked it, into there. So, all field hands, they worked on the same task at the same time. So, if it was time to harvest the cotton, all the field hands went out and harvested the cotton. If it's time to harvest tobacco, all the field hands went out and harvested the tobacco. And they usually worked from sun up to sundown. They were awoken very early to get started, and they worked till sunset, really, because this was before electric lighting. So you didn't have like when you guys drive down Kellogg at night or something, or down the road, you have lights to kind of show where you're going. They didn't have any of that then. Your source of light was the sun, and so you worked as long as the sun was shining. So, and also, the reason they kind of started so early was being down in the south, it gets really hot during the day. So, so by starting sooner, you're starting when it's cooler out. It's gonna be a lot easier to get work done. So, and field hands, usually they were not given a break during the day for lunch. they would get, they would work straight through the day, and that's just how it was. Yep, there you go. Men, women, and children, and even children older than about 10, usually did the same tasks. And that was just whatever the job was at the time. So, like I said, if you're picking cotton, if you're harvesting cotton, that's what you did. If you were harvesting tobacco, that's what you did. So, and the men, there wasn't really anything divided up by gender. It was honestly more kind of divided up by age. Younger, more and middle-aged slaves, they would have been the ones doing this hard labor. Sometimes the older slaves, they would get the kind of quote unquote easier tasks, something that would be easier on them, but still it had to be done. If they got sick, it really kind of, I guess, depended on how sick they were. I mean, if they physically cannot move, they're going to be able to have time to get better, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be mad. The potential owner's going to be mad at them. But if they can stand and everything, they're out in the fields. So, good question. So next, we're going to go ahead and take a look. We'll read the next two parts on page 425. So, where it says, working in the planter's house and working at skilled jobs, go ahead and read those two paragraphs there. And let's get started.
Some slaves worked as butlers, cooks, servants, nurses, and planters' home. These slaves often had better food, clothing, and shelter than the field hands did. But they often worked longer hours. They had to serve the family 20 hours a day. On larger plantations, some slave African Americans worked their jobs in factories or carpentry. Sometimes workers worked as slaves sell their services to other people. Often strangers collected a portion of what was earned by the slave in this way. In this way, some skilled slaves had to make money out of the slave owners. For example, William Ellison Bennett and Seth Mills are working for wages in the cotton gin. For years, he worked late at night and on Sunday. He bought his freedom with the money he saved. That's how he was able to buy the freedom of his wife and daughter. Wait, that part or what's this man?
All right, so let me go ahead and get into the next section. So, working in the planter's home. So, these are your house slaves. Go ahead and start kind of talking about them. So, like I said, some slaves, they actually worked as cooks, butlers, nurses in the planter's home. These slaves they actually had better food, clothing, shelter than the field hands did. They were treated a little better, just because they're with the family a little more, and so the family's gonna treat them a bit better. They often worked longer hours. Usually they had to serve the family 24/7. So, let's say the master needed something at 3 a.m. They were up at 3 a.m. getting whatever they needed. So it was, they did work longer hours, but, yeah. Nope. That is a lot shorter than I thought it was. So that's that. Does anybody have any questions about working in the planter's home and what it was like? Okay, so now I've got a short clip to talk about plantation life.
property, received no pay, were beaten or whipped for disobedience, and were bought and sold like animals. The large plantations in the South survived on slave labor. African Americans worked the fields, tended to the animals and farm chores, and worked. Life for an African American held as a slave in the southern United States between the years 1619 and 1860 was one of extreme hardship and injustice. African Americans living as slaves had no freedoms of their own, owned no property, received no pay, were beaten or whipped for disobedience, and were bought and sold like animals. The large plantations in the South survived on slave labor. African Americans worked the fields, tended to the animals and farm chores, and worked in the plantation homes as cooks, housekeepers, seamstresses, servants, and nannies, receiving nothing in return but inadequate food and shelter. African Americans who were held as house slaves had somewhat better treatment than those who worked in the fields, though African Americans who worked in the plantation homes were treated more as pets than people. African American families could be split up and sold at auction depending on the needs of their owners. A large plantation in the southern states could have as many as 100 African Americans working the day-to-day chores. African Americans were controlled by the overseer who woke them at dawn and often worked them until dark. African Americans who didn't obey the overseer could be badly mistreated and beaten. Slave quarters were built separately and away from the main plantation house. These quarters were usually one room, dirt floor cabins with a fireplace. In some cases, African Americans living as slaves were allowed to have small gardens, pigs, and chickens by their cabins. This helped to give them healthier diets, but often the overseers left them very little time in the day to tend these gardens. An African American born as a slave on a plantation could live out his or her whole life there. They might never see the world outside the plantation boundaries. Their days would be dedicated to serving their owner, never receiving payment or freedom.
So, very unfortunate, very sad life. So, let's see, working at skilled jobs. So, some enslaved African Americans said actually they worked at skilled jobs. Blacksmithing, carpentry, music playing. In fact, this picture here is from an old TV show called Roots. I know they redid it back in, I think, 2017, but this is from the original 1977 show, not quite sure, but this is Fiddler. It was his job to literally, he played music, and that was his chores. I mean, he did other stuff around the plantation, but one of his skilled jobs that he did was he played music. So sometimes planters actually let slaves sell their services to other people. So as we discussed yesterday, talking about buying freedom, this is how they earn that money. They would go out, do the job, and then make the money, and then come back. And when they came back, the planters often actually collected a portion of what was earned, but allowed slaves to keep the rest. And like I said, this allowed some skilled slaves to buy their freedom. Does anybody have any questions, kind of talking about skilled jobs for slaves? More?
How much did the planters normally take of the slaves' portion?
It just depended on the planter. I don't know if there's like a set amount that every planter, I don't think there was a set amount. It just depended on the planter themselves. sometimes they may take, it was probably like, a lot of probably just took 75% and allowed them to keep the rest. So, or, they may have taken a bit more and took them a lot longer to pay off or to buy their freedom. So, I'm really not sure how much actually took off. Good question. Anybody else? Okay. We go ahead and continue on. So, I want you guys to read Life Under Slavery. So, the rest of page 425, and then continue on to page 426, where it says, finish up that the living conditions portion. There's like 1 or 2 paragraphs on page 426. So, let's get started.
Generally, slaveholders use slaves to slaveholders bought and sold slaves to make a profit. The most common method of sale was that of auction. The auction itself determined whether families would be kept together or separated. Sometimes the buyer wanted the slave to fill a specific job, such as a heavy laborer, carpenter, or blacksmith. The buyer might be willing to pay for the slaves, might be willing to take for the slave who could do the work, but not for that slave's family. Families would beg their siblings to go for free African Americans. Slave traders sometimes pretended to have free African Americans who worked in slavery. For example, Solomon displayed the most of a free African American was kidnapped in Washington, D.C. and spent 12 years as a slave until he finally proved that entry enslaved people often grew living in humble conditions. Players housed them in dirty rooms, dirt floors, and the clothing given to them was so simple and made of cheap and coarse fabrics. Some slaves tried to brighten up their clothing by sewing on the first straps into the end. In this way, they played their invisible body for some last likewise, they expressed what they could do with their small grounds. Some planters were allowed slaves to grow gardens for vegetables and chicken spreads. Other slaves were able to add a little variety to their
A lot of some slaves they didn't really, but they're going to be caught. They use hounds. They use dogs to but some did run away. We did yesterday. I'll talk about it a little bit. Alright, so, what were some of the living conditions like for slaves? Riley?
Like a cabin with a dirt floor.
Cabin with dirt floor. What else? What was their clothes?
Cheap clothing with,
Right, yeah, they had the cheap clothing.
some allowed farm or like gardens.
Right, some were allowed to have gardens where they could grow some vegetables and things.
Like the horse farm.
Right, yeah, their clothing was very uncomfortable. It was not good quality like we have today. Very itchy, absolutely. So, slaveholders, they viewed really their slaves as property and not people. There's a very famous compromise, the 3/5 compromise, going back to actually the founding of America, talking about how they were going to decide representation, whether they were going to count slaves in the South as people, or if they were going to be considered property. So what they did was they decided to count these slaves as 3/5 of a person. So 3/5 of a person, which means they were 2/5 property. That was the thinking at the time. So that's messed up, right, guys? Like that sounds really most common method of sale was the auction. So, not to make light of the subject, but you guys ever watch Key and Peele? They do an episode. You guys ever seen the auction block episode? They didn't react that way, but that's how it would happen. They move slaves onto the auction block, and they would say, all right, who will give me X amount of money for this one? And they would just they would go back and forth, talking about, or trying to get the best price. So, the auction itself determined whether families would be kept together or separated. And like I said, you could, sometimes the slave owner, he would buy the entire family, or if he just wanted one person, he would buy one person. And that was actually one of the harshest things to them. The separation of families, it was incredibly scary. Yeah, separated families were separated with very little hope of ever coming back together. Because the day that you got separated, that may be the last day you saw your parents or your brother, your sister, someone like that. It was very scary for them, and it didn't leave them much hope of getting back together. So, slave traders they would even kidnap free African Americans and sell them into slavery. So, the very famous one was Solomon Northup. He was actually, there was a movie that came out a few years back called 12 Years a Slave. That was his story. He was a free man, and I don't remember where he was living, but he was kidnapped and sold into slavery. 100% free man, had a wife, family, wife and kids, and just sold into slavery. And he wrote a book, and the 12 Years a Slave was actually a book originally, and that was his story. His struggle from going from freedom to slavery, and then eventually, I believe he ran away and gained his freedom again. Oh, yep. 12 years he spent 12 years as a slave, so he finally proved his identity and gained his freedom. So, throughout these 12 years, he's telling people, hey, I'm a free man. I was born a free man. I was kidnapped into slavery. But people did not believe him. They said that he was lying. So, let's go ahead and, does anybody have any questions kind of about what life was like under slavery? Yes?
Why wouldn't they just run away?
Do what?
Why wouldn't they just run away?
So, that was not a guaranteed way of being free. A lot of slaves, they did run away and become free, absolutely. But there were other slaves that got caught, and punishments for that. You guys ever seen the big weights that they have in jails that they attach to their legs? That was one way of keeping them on the plantation. Or they also had specially made collars that they latched on them that had two pieces of iron that came off that had bells hanging on them. So it's like you guys have a cat or a dog or something that you have a bell on their collar. It tells you where they are. So you can't exactly escape with that around your neck. It make a lot of noise. And also, if they did run away, they were often found because they used dogs to smell them out. Kind of gave them a piece of clothing or something, and they sent them after them, and they often were finding them. So that's why. that make sense? Gabby?
How much did it cost to buy your freedom?
That depended on the master. It was, if your master said, hey, give me $2,000, you can have your freedom, that's what you would do. You would save up enough till you had $2,000. Sometimes it could be higher than that, it might be lower. It really just depended on whatever your master said.
How much did they sell the slaves on the auctions?
So, actually, I think it said in the book. So when we're talking about the cotton gin, I think it went back to there. Yeah, I think it was a couple $1,000s. Here we go. It would have been a few $1,000s. I mean, I think at one point, like, prior to the cotton gin, slaves were going for about $500, but after the invention, about $2,000.
At the auctions, what if like there's a traders looking to buy a slave, like they don't have to have the slaves like look to see if they're like or something.
Right, it also depended on their physical appearance. So if you're a strong, very muscular slave, they might buy it because they know, hey, they're gonna work well. If you're soft and squishy like I am, probably not so much. So it just depended on sometimes how they looked, and also, if they've been beaten up a lot, they might be very weak from that, and so they're not going to work as well. It's like trying to work with like a bum knee or something. You're not gonna perform to your best ability. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What happens is that the slaves that weren't sold?
I don't think they were returned to. I don't think they were given their freedom. I think they just waited until someone came along that bought them. Make sense? Yeah, but did you have a question? Did you? Awesome. So, I'm loving the questions, guys. This is awesome. Anybody have any other questions before we move on and start the next little section? Ready? They sat there. They would sit in cages. And this is because if you guys ever did watch the show Roots, it's very powerful. It's a lot of mature content. So, but at the beginning, the main character, start off with, his name is Kunta Kinte. They gave him the name Toby when he came, and they brought him into slavery. They showed him living in a cell, shackled and living. It was jail. It was like a prison. That's what it was like. And they gave him food, water, but mostly in shackles and behind bars. So, answer your question? Excellent. All right, let's go ahead and we'll get started with living conditions. We've got some time to get a couple things talked about. So, slaves, they would endure poor living conditions. Like we said, they were housed in dirt floor cabins with very few furnishings and often leaky roofs. And, clothing, like we said earlier, was often made from cheap and very coarse fabric. So, not good material to wear. All right, and let's see, it is 8:54. That is where we are going to end today. We will pick up with this tomorrow. Pick up on